So the topic that perhaps receives a lot of attention, actually probably quite wrongly in many ways, is the notion of acidosis, and primarily because people tend to associate acidosis with blood lactate concentrations. So let's kind of think about this a little bit. Well, if we go take this is from Fitz back in 1994. It's a fantastic paper in Physiological Reviews. And they write this for us. They write, the major source of acid production in skeletal muscle is the anaerobic production of lactic acid from glucose and glycogen. At physiological pH, the acid produced primarily dissociates into lactate and hydrogen ions. A relationship between lactic acid production and muscle activity has long been recognized. In the article entitled Lactate and Phosphagen Concentration in Working Muscle of Man, Carlson states that Berzelius wrote in layman in 1841, stating that he found lactic acid in the muscles of exhausted game. So this is wild birds. Writing in 1902, Fletcher states that in 1795, Van Humboldt showed that a frog's muscle, when exercised, kept its irritability longer in oxygen than in air or hydrogen. Fletcher and Hopkins concluded that oxygen delayed but did not prevent the loss of irritability in frog muscles contracted in vitro. So there's a lot going on there, isn't there? There's kind of connections to lactate, there's connections to force output and so on. But the key thing is that you've got to kind of get clear is the lactate is the byproduct of glycolysis, and the lactate is fundamentally pyruvate which interacts or is combined with a hydrogen ion. It is the hydrogen ion that creates the decrease in the pH, the acidic environment. And it is what people like Carlson are reporting that Berzelius found in 1841. You know, this notion they found that lactic acid was high in the game. Well, not surprisingly, because lactic acid reflects our use of anaerobic metabolism. So if you've got a game bird, so say a pheasant, and those pheasants have to fly very, very rapidly because, unfortunately people are trying to shoot them, which is the classic thing that happens. They're trying to get away from prey. They use anaerobic metabolism very rapidly. Well, because they use it very rapidly, it's highly fatiguing. They get that decrease in muscle glycogen. Because you're using glycolysis at a fast rate, or they're using glycolysis at a fast rate, same as we'd see in a human, because that is occurring, we are getting an increased hydrogen ion production. The hydrogen ions combine with the pyruvate to give us lactate. So, got to be clear, the lactate isn't the kind of the fatiguing factor, it's the association. It's the fact that the change in the cellular pH, as we saw under those kind of static conditions, it's the change in that cellular pH that really does seem to be one of the major contributing factors to muscle-based fatigue. So here we got some data to kind of reinforce this. So we've got blood lactate in our left panel and ATP and creatine phosphate in the right panel. And this is kind of before and then after exhaustive exercise. And what you can see here, doesn't matter who you kind of focus on, but what you can see here is here's our work time in minutes. And this is muscle lactate, so these aren't blood lactate concentrations. But you can see that over this kind of exhaustive period of exercise, in all the kind of the conditions, and these error bars represent on the x-axis variability for time, and on the y-axis variability for lactate concentration. These are group-based averages. You can say the blood lactate concentration rises. Okay, indication again of an increased rate of substrate level glycolysis. But at the same time, if we look in the graph here, we've got ATP, creatine phosphate. So what we can see is, yes, we can see that the creatine phosphate concentration decreases, as we saw under the static conditions, but we get that significant decrease. But look at the ATP concentration. There's a slight dip, but actually fundamentally, it remains pretty stable over the course of this 20-minute block of exercise, despite the fact that the muscle lactate concentration has risen. Now, if muscle lactate concentration is rising, we can be pretty certain that the cellular pH is decreasing. And that is the real connection here. As the pH decreases, that is what has the knock-on effect in terms of force generation. Why? Well, one of the major reasons is that those hydrogen ions have a really high affinity to the troponin complex within the sarcomere. In fact, they have an affinity which is about 238 times stronger than its affinity to calcium. So if you've got hydrogen ions attaching to the troponin complex, you reduce the number of active sites for force generation. The amount of force being produced decreases, which conforms to our explanation or our definition of what fatigue is. Because you've got hydrogen ions in the cell, hydrogen ions are positively charged. They're associated with acidity. Cell pH starts to decrease. So in this example here, so these are kind of force records, tetanic contractions again, single muscle fibers from the mouse. Okay, it's very, very small muscle fibers which are being evaluated here. So we've got control conditions, which are our solid line. And then what we've got is when the fiber is acidified. So what they've done is they have changed its pH only by 0.5 pH units. Remember, it's kind of a unitless value, but they've reduced the pH by 0.5. Look at the effect at both 12 degrees and 32 degrees C. So these are kind of temperatures which they operated in. So this is the force generation. This is our control condition. This is our kind of more acidic condition. So what you see is that the amount of force, the peak force, is significantly reduced. But actually, the time to peak force is fairly similar, but the peak force itself is reduced. But it's interesting, isn't it, that actually what they demonstrated on these lower temperatures, that actually you were able to sustain, or they were able to sustain with this frog muscle, able to sustain that force for a little bit longer. At 32 degrees C, same thing was observed, a reduction in the peak force, but this time actually it's not overly clear, but there is a decrease in an increase in the time taken to reach the peak force. But the rate of decline is faster. So we get a faster, it's only marginal, but there's a faster rate of decline under more acidic conditions than there was under those kind of more neutral conditions. And 32 degrees C is more indicative of kind of the cellular operating temperature than 12 degrees C would be. Now, if we go a little bit further here, so we've got force production in our panel on the left, and then we've got maximal shortening velocities, this kind of rate of shortening velocity. And what we've got here is we've got different temperatures. Okay, so we've got different temperature ranges, but what we've got is the change in the force. And this is really important because there is a connection here between acidity and temperature. Okay, so what you see is that the force in kind of acidotic response, look at the change. So when you go from 10 degrees to 30 degrees, you get that kind of change in force going from about 50% to around about 80%. But when you go from, say, 10 to 40, actually, we see we've gone from around about, what's this, about 70% to around about 90%. At no point do we get to the 100% thing, apart from for this example here. It's the same when we look at the velocity of shortening. So there's a real connection here between the temperature, cellular temperature, and the acidity of the environment. As the cell becomes more acidic, not surprisingly, because the direct effect of the acidity, but also because the acidity causes through feedback, it causes an acceleration in substrate turnover, which generates heat. It's not surprising that there is that direct connection between pH, decrease in pH, and an increase in cellular temperature. So if we then come forward, and I'm kind of going to leave this hanging a little bit. This is from a paper published back in 2006. And it perhaps offers an alternate argument, which is this. Acidification is being considered to be an important factor behind the reduced shortening speed in fatigue. However, using skinned rabbit muscle fibres, Pate and colleagues show that acidification has little effect on the shortening speed at 30 degrees C, which is again the standard operating temperature. Similarly, in intact mouse muscle fibres, the maximum shortening velocity was reduced by 20% as we saw at 12 degrees C, whereas there was no significant reduction at 32 degrees C. Thus, in mammalian muscles studied at physiological temperatures, cross-bridge function, i.e. the cyclic attachment and detachment of myosin heads to actin that results in muscle contraction, is little affected by acidification. So they're making an argument that actually everything we've been talking about probably isn't important. But there is a very important counter-argument to this. Remember, they've been dealing with skinned, intact but skinned muscle fibres. These are kind of muscle fibres that they have isolated. And they've done these in kind of water baths at constant temperatures. They are not a direct reflection of really what happens under dynamic conditions. And what we understand in more dynamic conditions is we don't see what they're reporting under these kind of very controlled laboratory conditions here. What we see under more dynamic conditions is we do see this change in pH. And we do see that there is a decrease in force output. Now, whether what these guys are saying here is right, which is, well, they're saying there isn't a direct effect. Well, that may well be the case. It may be that the decrease in pH isn't an A to B in terms of force generation. It may be that the decrease in pH, as we've kind of been alluding to, because the cell pH decreases, that therefore has an impact on metabolic processes. As the cell becomes more acidic, you get a deamination in enzymes, enzymatic processes slow down. Because enzymatic processes slow down, the ability, for example, to split phosphate from phosphocreatine decreases because that's an enzymatically driven process. The process of glycolysis slows down. Remember that the rate-limiting enzyme for glycolysis is phosphofructokinase, PFK. If the cell becomes more acidic, that process starts to decrease. Excuse me. Therefore, you can see how there is this potential, not direct A to B, but kind of a step response in terms of the cell becoming acidic. The net result is that decrease in force output within the muscle. And let's see if we can kind of see this perhaps more dynamically. So here we've got two conditions. What they've got here is they've got a control condition, and then they've got what they call a high lactate condition, and this is doing exhaustive exercise. So what they've done is they have infused the participants with lactate, and they've got kind of pre to post responses. And you can see, for example, here's the lactate concentration pre to post in the control condition, and again you can kind of see the same effect when they've got more kind of acidic environment. But actually, it does kind of lend itself until you start looking at the hydrogen ion concentration. Look at the hydrogen ion concentration here. This is a control condition, 67.9 millimoles per litre to 153. Okay, you go, well, that's quite significant. But look at the difference here, 79.2 to 221.7. That's the significant increase. The cell has become more acidic because the hydrogen ion concentration. Now, what they've not reported in here is the force output. But what you can see is the impact on enzymes such as glucose 6-phosphate and fructose 6-phosphate. Look at the impact here. So this is the kind of the concentration on the impact. So look at the change. Look at the change in these. And these kind of reflect a direct action of pH. And that ability, if those processes are changing, then the net result is that you're getting a decrease from, for example, we'd expect in force generation. And you can see these kind of highlighted here. So look at the glycogen content, look at the lactate, which didn't really have a significant change. The creatine phosphate content, interestingly, was no different. It rose. That's the kind of the creatine phosphate, overall creatine phosphate content, sorry, decreased. But it's no different between the two conditions. And again, it's maybe just a reflection of the activity that the participants were doing. And again, the same with the inosine monophosphate. It rose in both conditions, but there was nothing different. But it's that hydrogen ion and then the direct effect on the glucose 1, glucose 6, and fructose 6 phosphate concentrations that are of significance here.